look here, I'm going to share the screen. So we're going to explore what Nachama Liebowitz has to say and what her studies, her methodology, exploring the reasoning behind the 10 plagues. So before we look at that, and I'll just do a quick reminder of kind of the four major elements of Nachama Leibowitz's approach. But then want to hear from you, your thoughts before we look at what she brings to the fore from our commentators and how she puts it together. What is the reason for the 10 plagues? So Nachama Leibowitz's method, if you remember, her first question is kind of what is bothering the commentators, kind of looking at what in the pasuk, what in the verses drives commentators to say what, to even comment, period. Then look at the various commentators and compare one with another to see how each commentator is approaching that challenge, that kushya. Then third, looking at the pluses and minuses, the advantages of what each commentator has to say and the disadvantages of what each has to say. And then finally wrapping it all together and trying to ascertain meaning for our own lives. How does this apply to us today? So with that being said, we'll kind of take a step back here and I'll turn to you. Why were there 10 plagues? What was the reason behind the 10 plagues? Anyone?
Get Pharaoh to move.
Okay, so you say to get Pharaoh to move.
Well, he has to, in other words, to make him recognize that there is somebody who is on the side of the Jews who can do things that make it unpleasant for Pharaoh.
Okay, so I would argue those are maybe not exact, that you could, they're related, but right, one just to push Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. But maybe more so than that, you're saying is to make sure that Pharaoh recognizes that there is some greater power, this God.
Right.
And also to show the Jews.
Okay, so now there's three. You've given three reasons. Great. So right, to show the Jews how powerful God is too.
We're Jewish. We never have one reason.
All right, so I love it. Any others? Jackie? Yeah, Jacqueline.
Yeah, I was saying that we're seeing a power, pharaohs were holding themselves up as gods. But if somebody can create a situation that disturbs this so-called God and makes him miserable, so that obviously that he is not the God, this takes down his power. And makes people aware.
Like it pulls Pharaoh down a notch or 10.
Yes.
Right? Good.
If he's so good, how come all this stuff is happening?
How can all this happen on your watch? I love it. Yeah, Ron. Yeah.
I believe there's a midrash that says that it's a little bit of tit for tat. That for each plague there was something that Pharaoh had done. And I mean, obviously, the 10th one was killing the male children. So obviously, there had to be a death. There had to be death. But I don't know what the other ones are.
So interesting. I'm not sure if I know exactly what midrash you're referring to. Although, well, look, maybe it's one of the ones
I wouldn't know how to find it.
We're looking at Nachama Leibowitz's approach, which really is exploring the commentaries and how they compare. But from a modern scholarly approach, the plagues are often looked at in akin to what Ron is sharing as attacks or demonstrations that God is more powerful than the gods, quote unquote, of the Egyptians. The Nile, for instance, was seen as a god, essentially, right, in Egyptian culture. And here, the God of the Jews is able to turn that river into blood. The final plague, for instance, the death of the firstborn, actually, according to ancient Egyptian rule, according to ancient Egyptian understanding of the world, and frankly, ancient Jewish understanding of the world too, the firstborn child belongs to God. This was an ancient Near Eastern understanding. The firstborn child belongs to God. And in Egyptian, if the Pharaoh is the God, that means the firstborn is dedicated to Pharaoh. So the death of the firstborn is an attack is a polemic essentially against the Pharaoh, saying, you think the firstborn belongs to you. No, they belong to me. I mean, in fact, we see that the firstborn, it's not only the firstborn Egyptians that belong to God, it's the firstborn Israelites belong to God too. In fact, the Torah tells us you can redeem, right, your firstborn. We call it pidyon haben, literally the redemption of the first of the son, because really they belong to God. And in our eyes, right, that means belong to the priest, belong to, the worship of God and the practice. And the only way to prevent your firstborn son from going into that practice, to being dedicated to God, was by presenting, a symbolic amount of money to redeem your child, your firstborn son.
I don't know if this is going to interfere with Nachama Liebowitz, and you could just move it aside. But
Okay.
did they actually? I can understand all the other plagues. What God did, the miracles, or whatever, however we want to describe it. But the killing of the firstborn, how to pick the firstborn, did it actually take place? Were all the firstborn? How far did they go? How many people did they?
So according to the Torah, so there's two questions I'm hearing, and I'm not sure what you're asking, but I'll share both, right? According to the Torah, it says from the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn, of the lowest person, and the firstborn of the animals too.
Animals, yeah.
So every firstborn child, and in fact, right, the Torah says that the Israelites firstborn would have been killed too, but they were instructed to place the blood of the
The
Paschal
sign on the door. Yeah.
on their door, which we know, the Paschal offering on our Seder plate. And in fact, the location of our mezuzah today is from this story as well. We place the mezuzah on the doorpost right in the same location, as a sign of protection, just as the Paschal offering, the blood was placed on that place on the doorpost.
I'm conflating two things, and I just wonder, the story of Samuel as a firstborn to Hannah, and he was dedicated to the temple.
So right, so theoretically, Samuel, it could have been Hannah could have performed pidyon haben. That's in this particular case, Hannah makes a dedication, like a vow, that if she has a child, she'll dedicate that child to the temple service. So it's interesting, we don't hear about pidyon haben in the stories in the books of the prophets, but
again,
right.
The child is nominally given to the priests,
Correct, yeah.
but if you're already a priest, you don't have to perform a pidyon haben. So we
Correct,
never had
because
one in
right.
my family.
Right, if you're a Kohen, you're already dedicated, right?
We're
so
already in the family.
You didn't have the pidyon haben ceremony if you were a Kohen already, correct? So right, the other point, which is a historical point, and I don't know if this is what you were asking, Sheila, if this ever took place historically, that's a separate question, and that we don't have any extra biblical evidence outside of the Bible, to know whether or not these things happen, but that's a separate.
No, because we killed them when they crossed the sea. The waves came and they all died.
Right, the Egyptian army, yeah.
But it's harder to find which one is the oldest in each family. That's my point.
Our understanding is that God knows who the oldest is, right? But I hear you. So we're going to look at what is the purpose of the plagues here, and what Nachama Liebowitz, kind of how she guides this discussion. So we'll start here with this verse. This is Exodus chapter 5, verse 2. Helena, do you want to read?
ויאמר פרעה, מי אדוני אשר אשמע בקולו לשלח את ישראל? לא ידעתי את אדוני וגם את ישראל לא אשלח.
Okay, do you want to say?
Paro said, who is Adonai that I should heed him and let Israel go? I do not know Adonai, nor will I let Israel go.
Good, thank you. So this verse really is at the very beginning of the narrative of the 10 plagues. And really the story of the 10 plagues comes shortly following this verse. And so why do the 10 plagues happen? The first thing that Nachama Liebowitz points out is 10 different times in the chapters following this verse that are essentially God, responding to this statement. Who is Adonai that I should heed him and let Israel go? I don't know this God, I don't know this Adonai, nor will I let Israel go. And so
Well, it
what do
also
we see?
displays Pharaoh's ignorance.
Well, right. So you could say, right, this is Pharaoh's ignorance. God, who is this? Pharaoh in his eyes is the God, right? Who is this God of the Israelites? Who is this Adonai?
Yeah, but Pharaoh is used to seeing with what Jackie just said. Pharaoh is used to seeing a physical person, physical, even if it's a statue.
Okay,
And
for something
power
that's
and Adonai is someone amorphous. We
right,
don't see him.
right, something visible at least, right? Something you can
Yeah.
see.
There's no visible manifestation.
But also Pharaoh thought that he's God.
That's
Everybody
right.
was
And
so
he's visible,
why?
but he's
Yeah.
visible, Helena.
Right.
He is visible. So that's the whole point. Yeah, they're all gods. Zeus, they have a what do you call it again? A statue of.
Right. So the first thing, though, right, is while Pharaoh won't ever see the Lord, won't ever see God Adonai, the whole rest of the parsha that we're talking about, the era and Bo, is all filled with, attempting to prove, to Pharaoh the might of God and to make sure that Pharaoh knows God.
God does things.
Right, we'll look at 10 different verses following. Chapter 7, verse 5. And the Egyptians shall know that I am Adonai when I stretch out my hand over Egypt and bring out the Israelites from our midst. Again, thus says Adonai, by this you shall know that I am Adonai. See, I shall strike the water in the Nile with the rod that is in my hand, and it will be turned into blood. What is happening? It's not just that I'll turn the water into blood, but the reason is so that you shall know that I am Adonai. Continuously, for tomorrow, he replied, as you say, that you may know there is none like God. Chapter 8, verse 18, right? On this day I will set apart the region of Goshen where my people dwell, so that no swarms of insects shall be there. This is the plague of the locusts, that you may know that I am Adonai in the midst of the land. Constantly, it's about you knowing. And we can look in the Hebrew, Lema'an Teda ki ani Adonai, right? I didn't look at the Hebrew in all of them, but the same idea. Ba'avur teda ki ein kamoni b'chol ha'aretz. For this time I will send all my plagues upon your person and your courtiers and your people, in order that you may know that there is none like me in all the world.
There's also a question is, he's doing all these plagues. The Jews are exempt from it, but do the Egyptians realize that the Jews are exempt for it? In other words, the
presumably,
emphasis
yes.
is on God, but
they're
living in another part of the country.
So yes or no. And actually this verse 8:18, we could argue that this means the Egyptians know, but also you is the Israelites, so that you, the Israelites, may know that I am Adonai also, right?
Yeah.
So
that's the one I was
Sheila, you
referring
shared
to.
all of those answers, right?
Yeah.
So that you,
That's where I was thinking.
Paro know, you, the Egyptians know, but also you, the Israelites, understand this isn't, a joke, this is God. Right. And I'm just going to scroll through them. It continues here.
Serious power.
Verse 29, right? This is Moses said to him, as I go out of the city, I shall spread my hands to Adonai. The thunder will cease and the hail will fall no more. This is the end of the plague of Barad, of hail, so that you may know that the earth is Adonai, right? Lema'an teda ki l'Adonai ha'aretz, that it all belongs to God. Continue. 10 different times in just the narrative of the plagues, right? And that you may recount in the hearing of your child and of your child's child how I made a mockery of the Egyptians and how I displayed my signs among them, in order that you may know that I am Adonai. This is specifically to the Israelites, actually.
Yeah, so suddenly the beginning ones are to the Egyptians. Now he's telling the Israelites.
So right, some of these right are
Yeah.
towards the Egyptians, some towards the Israelites. Vidatem ki ani Adonai. Right, and finally, Lema'an ted'un asher yafle Adonai bein Mitzrayim uvein Yisrael, so that you may know that Adonai makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel.
I never heard the part about the dogs.
Yeah.
That's a new one.
You want to know what the context is here?
Not a dog shall
Ebenezer
snarl.
lo yecherot kelev
I can
l'shono. Yeah.
I can pull up the. Well, let's see. We click
We've
on it.
got it there.
You have the verses here, yeah.
Yeah. That's the first time I've heard about the dog that shall
Yeah.
snarl.
It's
Right.
been there every year when we've read it.
We read it each year, but no, it is. But good. That's the reason we read. There's always something new that.
And
that you
that dog is important because it decides whether or not something's chometz or not, too.
Okay. So I actually wanted, Sheila, you mentioned, right, in
Kosher
order,
dog.
the first reason you gave, in order that Pharaoh would let the Israelites go. But there's one challenge in the text to that, and that's that God seems to harden Pharaoh's heart. So if it really, the purpose of the plagues were to push Pharaoh to let them go, then why would God harden Pharaoh's heart? So that's but here, v'chizakti et lev paro, then I will stiffen Pharaoh's heart and he will pursue them. Why will God gives a reason for stiffening Pharaoh's heart. This is, crossing the Red Sea and the splitting of the sea. God will cause the stiffening of the heart so that the Egyptian army will pursue them. And I may gain glory through Pharaoh and all his hosts, and the Egyptians shall know that I am Adonai. And they did so.
And it was actually more than just the Egyptians. The whole known world at those times found out.
So right, so the Torah says the Egyptians, but right, we understand it was really so that the entire world would know that this is Adonai, that this is God.
Do we ever find any evidence of this in any of the other writings of the other Greeks or Romans or the other people?
No, there's no other than translations of the Bible, like the Septuagint. There's no other, documentation of the Exodus from Egypt to anywhere else. There might be similar stories.
Similar stories. I mean, we're not going to find the exact one.
Yeah, the Egyptians only documented things where they were winners.
Well, that does tend to be true. But right, let the Egyptians know that I am Adonai when I gain glory through Paro, his chariots, his riders. V'yadu Mitzrayim ki ani Adonai. We see over and over and over again the plagues, at least in the text itself, the plagues are there so that the people, everyone, right, the Egyptians, the Israelites, Paro, know who God is. This is all kind of a response to Pharaoh's question, who is this God? And so now Nachama Liebowitz is looking at what some of the commentators have to say. So we'll look at Abarbanel as a medieval commentator. Ron, are you there? Do you want to read here in English?
Not particularly.
Okay. All right. Does anyone want to read?
I'll read.
All right.
Pharaoh took issue with Moses on three principles. Moses assumed the existence of a necessary, existent first cause, whereas Pharaoh denied it, saying, I know not the Lord. The second principle Moses laid down was that God watches over the ways of men and metes out reward and punishment accordingly, which Pharaoh repudiated by inquiring, who is the Lord? The third principle Moses asserted was that the provident God is the God of Israel, and all-powerful, able to change the nature of things according to his will. Pharaoh denied this mockingly, saying, who is the Lord that I must obey him? In other words, what power does he possess that the plagues came, that I must submit to his demands? It was for this that the plagues came, to confirm these three principles. The first of three plagues came to prove God's existence. The next three asserted the second principle, the providence of God. The last four came to substantiate the third principle, that God can change the nature of things at will.
Okay,
There are a
good.
lot of things. There's something else where they also have the 3, 3, and 4. And they
Right. So
divide how the response is or something. I remember.
right. So Abarbanel looks at this and he, takes them as we still do in our Seder today. It splits them into Detzach Adash Be'achav, which is this acronym, which splits them into the three sections.
Ah,
And we still actually say that. We still have that in our Haggadot at the end of the 10 plagues. It talks about the rabbis having divided them and creating this mnemonic, dividing them into these three sections. So Abarbanel wants to understand, and really that's the question. One of the questions driving here is why 10? What are the purpose of each? And so Abarbanel understands it really as having three. They're split into these three sections.
In which case, you only needed to have 3 plagues, one for each section.
So right, why do we need 10? Right, good. Good. Although if the Egyptians weren't letting the Israelites go after 3, then you needed to continue to have more. But right, which is part of the understanding here.
Well, we're
but
talking about power at that point. And so Pharaoh's asking to demonstration of power. And so they're just letting him have it.
Right. So no good. So Nachama Liebowitz writes here that this 3-part, breakdown may seem artificial, but an analysis of the 10 verses that were cited at the beginning in their context does seem to indicate that the knowledge of God, which the plagues were meant to instill, is understood in 2 senses, as referring to his justice and mercy. And so I'm going to share here. These are the first 2 verses that refer to the plagues as a whole, refer to these aspects of God, justice and mercy. These are Exodus 7, 4, and 5. These are the first verses we'll look at. I can pull them in here. So we look in English, but we can look at the Hebrew too if you want. These are the first verses that talk explicitly about the plagues as a whole. When Pharaoh does not heed you, I will lay my hand upon Egypt and deliver my ranks, my people, the Israelites, from the land of Egypt with extraordinary chastisements. And we'll look in the Hebrew, chastisements, bishfatim gedolim. And the Egyptians shall know that I am Adonai when I stretch out my hand over Egypt and bring out the Israelites from their midst. So what are the 2 things that the plagues are all about here that Nachama Liebowitz pulls out 2 major themes? Justice, that the Egyptians will get the justice that should be meted out to them. And then God will also bring out God's mercy towards the Israelites. So we see the dual themes of justice and mercy.
it's interesting. Why does he have to take them out if he's saving them? In other words, he's not trusting the Egyptians anymore. And therefore he's going to take the Israelites out and back to Canaan. It's an interesting play here.
Yes, but part of taking the Israelites out of Egypt is so that the Egyptians shall know that I am Adonai, which I think is interesting as well, right? That it's not only for the Israelites' sake that God is bringing them with an outstretched hand. It's so that the Egyptians, and by extension, I think as Ron mentioned, that the entire world, Egypt at the time was the most powerful nation, the most powerful empire, that by extension, the entire world will know through these actions that I am Adonai, God says.
Well, everybody except the Amalekites, of course.
Well, yeah, they don't seem to heed the warning.
Anything.
That is true. So sometimes the plagues involve series. this is what Nachama Liebowitz writes. Henceforth, the two aspects interchange of justice and mercy. Sometimes the plague involved serves to instill in them a knowledge of the divine attributes of judgment and retribution, at others, those of compassion and mercy. And she then asks her readers to compare, as we talked about, compare different interpretations. She asks us to compare three different commentaries, three different midrashim, I should say, on the purpose of the first plague. And so that's the plague she wants to look at to compare. So this is Shmot Rabbah. This is a midrash asking the question on the first plague. Why was the water afflicted first with blood? Sheila, do you want to read?
Why was the water afflicted first with blood? It is because Pharaoh and the Egyptians worshipped the Nile. The Holy One, blessed be he, said, I will smite the god first and then his people. As the saying goes, smite the gods and the priests will be afraid.
Okay, good. So this is, Ron, this may have been part of the midrash that you were referring to, actually. But this midrash is giving a reason. Why did God start with this plague of the water turning to blood? It's because Pharaoh and the Egyptians worship the Nile as a god, and here God is saying, I will smite their god first, and then his people, because once the god is smited, once the god is attacked, it causes fear among all the people. So that's Shmot Rabbah. That's the first midrash.
But then he's
Mishnah
also
Rabbi-
acknowledging that the Nile is the god and that Pharaoh is not necessarily the god.
Interesting. So Pharaoh is seen as kind of a godlike person, but this was the reason, right? The Nile is something that was worshipped.
Well, they were very dependent on the Nile for sustenance. It was the Nile running over with the flooding that blessed the land, so that it would bring things. You fill it with
They
blood.
do. They
It's
still
not
do.
going to. It's not going to feed them if it's not water.
Right. So some positives. Any downsides to understanding this is the reason behind the first plague? So in Nachama Leibovitz's approach, she looks to compare these different understandings. So we'll move to the next two, and then we'll share thoughts on each of them and see how they compare. So Mishnat Rabbi Eliezer asks the same question. Why did God bring upon them the plague of blood? Because they threw the children of the Israelites into the river, as it is written, every male child that is born shall ye cast into the river. This is at the beginning of the story, right? Therefore, God punished them through the waters of the Nile. Any thoughts on this explanation? In Midrash?
That one sounds closer to what I was talking about.
Okay. Okay, good. So the first one, the reason was to attack, a polemic against the gods of the Egyptians, against what they worshipped. Here, it's kind of tit for tat. You threw our babies into the Nile. Here, we're going to punish you through that same river that you punished us with. And finally, Lekach Tov, another midrash. Because they split the blood of the Israelites like water, and this pulls a verse from Psalms, the canals ran blood and their flowing water they could not drink. So because the people, is similar to number two, but because of the way the Egyptians treated the Israelites over the course of their time that they were enslaved, and it pulls a verse from Psalms as kind of a proof text. So any thoughts? Which one which one would you want to be your midrash?
Split or
Eric?
spilt? That translation, I think it's the translation. Because they split or spilled, as in
Oh, you know what?
shed.
It might be a typo here. Because they spilt the blood. You may be right.
It makes more sense as spilt or spilled.
Sorry, it's a typo. Because they spilled the blood.
Yes, that makes more sense.
My mistake.
That makes sense, actually. That last one
Because
does
they
make sense.
spilled the blood of the Israelites like water.
Yep.
But good. So any votes here? Well, stop the share. Who prefers the first midrash? The second or the third? Any votes?
I like the third.
I can vote. I mean, you already know what my vote is. It's the middle one.
Right, so you shared about the middle one, good. So Nachama Leibowitz isn't taking a vote which one is better than the others, but she does note that the latter two midrashim interpret the plagues really as a punishment, measure for what the Egyptians did. The Egyptians spilled our blood, so we, are turning their water into blood. The Egyptians threw our babies into the Nile and punished us through the Nile, so we're going to punish the Egyptians through the Nile. The first midrash, however, was really more theological, in terms of its understanding of our God, that the people worshipped the Nile, and here our God is demonstrating, no, you have this Nile is just a river that's under my control, God, right? It kind of adds a theological aspect to the narrative.
The last two bring everything close to home, where the people were dependent on the Nile for their very lives, and to see that basic thing taken and made unusable.
Right. Right, and we're gonna explore here a few more what Rashi has to say. Because Rashi also comments on this. Rashi usually his attempt is to try to find the most simple, plain meaning of the text. That simple is probably not the right word, but he strives to find a meaning that doesn't require stories that are not found in the Bible as much as he's able to. He does bring in midrash much of the time. In fact, he brings in a midrash here from Tanchuma, and they shall be turned to blood, meaning the Nile, the waters of the Nile. And Jacqueline, to your point, this is what he says: because rain does not fall in Egypt, but the Nile rises and irrigates the land, and the Egyptians on this account worship the Nile, right? The Nile was really, so important to the agriculture and to growing food. But because of that importance, that was why God first smote their deity and afterwards smote them. To show how powerful this Nile, which was so important to your livelihood, to your way of life, to your ability to live, that's the first thing that God is going to smite. So I'm gonna stop the share here. In other words, this is what Nachama Leibowitz writes: Rashi's choice of explanation is determined not by ideological considerations, but by contextual ones. The verse which contains Moses' announcement to Pharaoh of the forthcoming plague of blood distinctly states, "By this thou shalt know that I am the Lord. Look, I shall now strike the water in the Nile, and it will turn to blood." So the purpose of turning the Nile to the blood in its own context is that Pharaoh will know that God is the Lord, that Adonai.
That's an extremely visible thing.
Right, it's extremely visible. But Rashi is unwilling to use the midrashim that we saw because he doesn't want to pull it out of context, that it's so that Pharaoh knows that God is Adonai, the power of Adonai and who Adonai is. And that's exactly, how Nachama Leibowitz sees. He can't see it as like something that's retribution. All three midrashim look at it as retribution, right? Retribution for throwing the children into the Nile, retribution for spilling our blood. He wants to, stress its educational character, that the plague is there to educate you on who Adonai is, right? And that's how Rashi looks, and that's kind of where Nachama Leibowitz is coming, as she explores the reasoning for the plagues. Knowing that this is Adonai is really the core of how she views, based on what the text says, the core of what the plagues really are about in context. And I'll share a little about the last plague in this parsha, which is this. She writes on Parashat Va'era, which actually just has the first 7 plagues. So the final plague in this parasha is barad, is hail. And
Isn't everything that God does designed to show us that he is God?
sorry?
Isn't everything that happens a designed by God to show us who he is and his power?
So in this
No, they're
story,
all
we do,
didactic. Yeah.
yeah, we do see that these stories are to show not only Pharaoh and the Egyptians, but also to show the Israelites. Remember, have been slaves for, depending on what count you use, 250 years or 400 years. You know, they need to see that God, you know, they need to see God's might as well. In fact, there's a midrash, some of you may know, the plague of darkness, that God uses this plague of darkness to kill those Israelites who weren't ready to believe, who weren't ready to accept God. It's kind of a harsh look, you know, but there's this sense that it was not easy for the Israelites after this time in slavery to be ready to accept God either. And you may know even the midrash at Mount Sinai. I mean, the Torah says na'aseh v'nishma. We will do before we hear. But there's, of course, a famous midrash that says that when they say that, God is holding Mount Sinai over their head, right? Ready to drop in and destroy them. And so it's in fear of destruction that they're saying this, and that midrash is like.
What you see is very convincing.
Right. It is very convincing, right? And I want to just share, because after the plague of hail, something interesting happens, which doesn't happen in any of the first 6 plagues. This is chapter 9, verse 27. After the plague of Barad, the plague of hail, Pharaoh says, Chatati hapa'am, Adonai hatzadik, va'ani ve'ami hareshaim. This time I am wrong, the Lord is right, Adonai is right, and I and my people are the villains. So what happened to cause Pharaoh to suddenly acknowledge Adonai, and that Adonai even is correct?
And this is a result of the hail.
This comes, right, as a result of the hail. It's also compounded on top of the other 6 plagues that happened before the hail too. But yes, it comes after the hail.
If you get one
sometimes
hail the size of a baseball and it hits you in the head, you
maybe that was all it took. That was what needed to happen for Pharaoh to decide. Although it doesn't really, because Pharaoh then doesn't allow the people to go, and then there's still 3 more plagues. But what happens here? Tanchuma, the rabbi said, after none of the plagues did Pharaoh assert the Lord is just, except after the hail. Why? One who seeks to attack his fellow and overcome him will take him by surprise, kill him, and take all he possesses. But what does God say in this particular plague? And I'm going to read it, because this is, in this Tanchuma, it says, but the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Pharaoh, send therefore now and gather thy cattle. It was then that Pharaoh was moved to assert that the Lord is just. So what does God say in the lead up to the plague of Barad? Chapter 9, verses 18 and 19. This time tomorrow I will rain down a very heavy hail, the likes of which has never been seen in Egypt since the day it was founded till now. Now therefore send for and hurry in all thy livestock and all that thou hast in the field, every man and beast found in the field and not brought into the house, the hail will come down on it and it will die. So Pharaoh, according to the rabbis and according to the Tanchuma, the fact that God is actually giving a warning, not only to the people, but to the animals as well, is what the rabbis say cause Pharaoh to recognize in this instant that he's been wrong and that Adonai is right. That Pharaoh is recognizing the justness of God, and God's willingness here to protect, to even in the midst of this plague that's demonstrating God's might. It's not about killing and attacking, and that's the way that's the way the ancient world worked. If you're attacking, you attack to kill, you attack to destroy. Here, God is not attacking. The Israelites, Adonai is not attacking to kill, attacking to destroy. In this instance, God is actually giving warning and telling them to move inside.
But wait a minute, is he also giving the warning to the Egyptians? Or they would have heard it from, we're assuming that they didn't hear anything and that the Pharaoh didn't hear anything, that the Pharaoh could have said.
So these words are spoken to Pharaoh. These words are spoken to Pharaoh. Yeah, so
Pharaoh knows this is going to happen.
Correct.
All right, but he does nothing about it. He does not believe God's going to do anything, and therefore he doesn't protect his own animals and whatnot.
Well, it's not, according to the understanding of the tradition, it doesn't impact the Israelites, right? In fact, just before here, chapter 9, verse 14 to 16, makes the comment as well. But I have let you survive, speaking to Paro, only for this purpose, in order to show thee my power and spread my fame through the earth. Right. So the plagues are very, there's time and again, the plagues are moving Pharaoh to let the Israelites go, but perhaps even more so than pushing the Israelites to go, it's demonstrating to Egypt and by extension through to the entire world the power of Adonai. You don't mess with Adonai. This is the God of the most. This is the only God, right? This is God.
But I think the fact that he controls his power, he doesn't just unleash this thing where he kills everybody, that he has control over where it goes and who it attacks. And so he's demonstrating the control of all of the powers that he has.
Right, there's control, and Nachama Liebowitz, because I'm going to come here to this final kind of how she brings these ideas together. She mentions earlier that all of the plagues are connected to either to the aspect of justice or the aspect of mercy. And here she sees them rolled together all in one. There's justice, the hail is going to fall, and you've never seen anything like this. And there's also this aspect of mercy. Here, protect yourselves, protect your animals. That compassion that informs the divine judgment, Nachama Liebowitz sees in Pirkei Avot, sees in our tradition. And this is how Sforno understands a verse in Pirkei Avot. So that I might show you my power, he says, is to move you to repent. Is that really the power can move you to compassion. As it is written, to repent so that God can demonstrate God's compassion. As it is written, for I have no pleasure in the death of him that dies. This is from Ezekiel. Send therefore now and gather thy cattle to enable the servants who tend the cattle to get away, as our sages had declared, beloved is man who was created in God's image. Sforno is looking at this. Sheila, do you want to say something?
Yeah, God is doing so much damage to the Egyptians, and yet they seem to survive. Whatever he does, he doesn't knock it out for everybody. I mean, the Nile is bloody, and for whatever it does to the rest of the country, the Egyptians seem to manage to survive it all.
No, and it's actually an interesting point we don't think about, too often. The purpose of the plagues is not, and God's intent is not to destroy the Egyptians. Yes, the firstborn dies, and yes, the Egyptian army drowns in the sea, which we see
but
as
not
necessary.
everybody.
But it's all in the gut. We see it as necessary for our survival. There is never an intent to destroy the Egyptians.
He wants them to start to know his power.
Right.
Because Pharaoh kept saying he didn't know this God.
Right. There's
So
really, as
you
say,
want to cure the problem of ignorance.
Right. There's really an insistence on keeping the Egyptians alive so that they know God's power and God's might, right?
So they're witnesses.
So right, that they can serve witness, essentially, correct. And so this is what I want to share, and this is kind of how Nachama Liebowitz pulls these ideas together. Both justice and mercy, and the educational, the fact that the plagues are really educational more than they're about destruction. because it's not about destroying the Egyptians. It's about serving witness, about knowing who God is. And she writes her final words here. The purpose of the plagues was educational, to instill acknowledgement of God in those who had hitherto refused to acknowledge him. This purpose is echoed in the form, content, and wording of the plagues, in particular in the seventh one, this plague of Barad. God's method of teaching his creatures is to, quote, remember compassion in anger. And she feels like this plague of Barad really encapsulates that. There's anger, the hail coming down, the anger, over the Egyptians and Pharaoh not letting the people go. But even in that moment, remembering God's compassion in protecting the people and even the animals. And that's really, the message that she, derives from the plagues and the rationale from the plagues is remembering, one, the educational value and the education that this is God's might, and to acknowledge that. But what does it mean to acknowledge God? What does God want? God wants us, even in our anger, to demonstrate compassion. And we actually show that in our Passover Seder. We take out a drop of wine for each of the 10 plagues to show that even in our, in our joy over the anger that God kind of poured out God's wrath upon the Egyptians, we are saddened by the destruction that did need to take place and remove a drop of wine.
And we don't say Lolanu, those two prayers in the Hallel.
Right, that's another example, right? That's not not for exactly the same reason, because we do say them the first 2 days of Pesach, just not the last 6 days of Pesach. We say them on Yom Tov, the beginning Yom Tov of Pesach. But that's correct. We don't say them the end of the Chol HaMoed and the end of Pesach. And that idea, though, sticks with Jewish tradition. As we have a midrash, the Israelites splitting the sea and the Song of the Sea, and according to a famous midrash, Avot Rabbi Natan, the angels are singing praise to God.
And they're admonished for
and
doing
they're admonished
that.
by God. How can you sing when my creatures are drowning? So this idea of anger with compassion, that Nachama Liebowitz reads from the story of the plagues, and how she interprets, is something that continues out and we act on throughout our history. And I think it sometimes is the reason why we sometimes are at unease with the concept of God's anger. We see it actually, Shfoch Chamatcha is a paragraph usually connected to opening the door for Elijah. There's a paragraph that was entered into the Haggadah around the time of the Crusades, which says, pour out your wrath upon the nations who do not know you. And this paragraph makes a lot of sense if you're living in a time where the non-Jews that live around you were known to come and crusade and kill and destroy communities. In a time where that's not happening, that paragraph gives us a little unease, because there is, we understand the anger at our enemies, or the anger needed to destroy those who hate us, but we also feel the compassion, that Nachama Liebowitz is reflecting here as well.
It's interesting that we open the door, and we should be shutting the door and locking the door if we're worried about our enemies.
Well, we open the door right for Elijah's coming, saying that the time is near at hand, that the Messiah and that peace, is at hand, and this won't be the case anymore. But good, Helena, did you have something you wanted to share?
Yeah. Speaking of opening the door, one of my friends just called me and told me that they told her from City Hall, I don't know from where, to lock all the doors and put the alarms that there are people who are coming and opening doors and trying
There was a code red from the city of Pepper Pike. They had 10 incidents.
Right.
10 incidents. With people in the house or with people out of?
They were searching the driveways. They were checking the doors, and they were checking the doors of the cars. And I guess they have it on the ring. That's how
it was at nighttime, in the middle of the night, though.
Okay, no,
Alright.
it is scary, yeah.
It is
Yeah, Ron,
scary,
sorry.
especially when you live alone. Yeah.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to say also, I used to always invite people, non-Jewish people that I used to work with for Rosh Hashanah Tamid, breaking of the fast, all kind of Sukkot. But I had always this uneasiness because of Shpoch Hamatcha ala Goyim, because I felt uneasy with that.
So you need some modern Haggadot, and actually it's rooted already, was first found in a 14th century Haggadah in Italy, where there was a different paragraph added, Shfoch ahavatcha, pour out your love upon the nations who do know you, to flip it out. And there was actually a Siddur, a Haggadah
That's
found.
very good. I'm going to change it.
And so you can find there are some Haggadot that have taken that from, which is 700 years old, and have taken that to now re-put it in, because of our uneasiness. It's
Yeah.
understandable why the communities, who wrote that in the time they lived in the place they lived in. But as we develop, God willing, good relations with those living around us and our neighbors, that's not necessarily what we want. But at the same time, we do have enemies, sadly, today, and we do understand where that paragraph is coming from. Yeah, Ron, did you have something to share?
Yeah. So going back to this compassion, here God is showing compassion to the Egyptians in the seventh plague. And so where was that compassion with the Korach story and with the Aaron's sons and who knows how many other times? Where was that compassion?
It's a good question.
Interesting.
And I do an exercise. This isn't
I
really
meant to start
with.
with here's what's bothering Rafi.
No, it's good. It's good. I hear you. I've done exercises with students sometimes, but also, with anyone we can do, is pulling different stories and trying to describe God based on different narratives in the text. And the description of God would be very different, if you looked at the story of Korach versus the story of, depending on what story you look at, you could get a very different understanding of God.
But
But
it
all
says
this
every
happens-
morning. I'm sorry, Sheila.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Every morning we are reading, and it says El Nokem, but also Rachaman in the
Right.
same paragraph.
So that's right. That's the duality that what you're saying, and exactly this anger and compassion, that God has both poles. God has both, the vengeful God, and also the compassionate God. And
We also have those instances where he had to be reminded by Moshe that he had compassion.
so right, Moses is playing to God's compassion, and God has both the element of vengefulness against our enemies, or against one's enemies, and the compassion, and we see different, we see in some stories the vengeful God, appear more strongly, and in some stories we see the compassionate God appear more strongly. But both elements exist within God's nature.
Again, it's the controls factor.
Well, right. So
Right.
God is in, right. God has control. God has the power, and God is in control. So as we look not only at this story, but in every story, right, we can think about kind of that duality. I taught a number of years ago for Tikkun Leil Shavuot, a class that was called a God of vengeance or God of compassion. Right? It's something that kind of looked at stories and narratives in the text, and are, even in the way we want to view God. There are times, and I think this is also, there are times in Jewish history that we want to see God as a God of vengeance. I think even today we see, what Hamas just did. We want a God of vengeance that will be, will give us retribution for the crimes committed against us. But there are also times in our lives, or times in our history, where we want to see the God of compassion. And so both kind of exist, and there are, you know, different times where we feel more connected to one versus the other. But again, of course, all of these are part of God. And as
And we want to
Jackie said,
emulate God. We want to
sorry?
make ourselves holy.
So, right, we want to make, well, yes, we want to make ourselves holy.
And that
we know
creates
both of these
problems.
aspects and both of these elements are part of a part of that holiness.
Exactly.
So I see it's 8:30. So thank you. It's been great to learn the last few weeks with everyone. And I encourage you to pick up, you know, Nachama Leibowitz's worksheets, or perhaps, you know, as I have, these are the books we have in our library, which have studies from Nachama Leibowitz, and have each parsha. It has like 5 or 6 mini chapters on each parsha, focusing on different verses or different ideas in the parsha. Are always great to kind of use as a resource to kind of understand and compare different commentaries. And I do want to
Interesting that it's a woman.
Yeah, no, and I
Well-
think, Baz, we talked about this the first unit, you know, how in a world that was so predominantly male, actually, that she, you know, became so prominent, and really helped revive the study of Bible and commentary in
She
this
came from a
century.
very special family. Her brother was our teacher in medical school. He was
Yeshayahu
Yeshayahu Liebowitz. He
Yeah.
was unbelievable.
Yeah.
Very bright, very, very religious, very bright, amazing guy.
Mm,
Good. Yeah.
We need those kinds of people.
Yeah, no, a lot of scholarship right in the family, but her brother was a great scholar also. Yeah, man. So definitely continue to learn. I'll continue to use some of what she puts together in future times, whether or not it's about her specifically. I think her knowledge informs, you know, Bible study and Torah study to a great deal today when you're looking at the medieval commentators, 2 commentators of today. Next week, in fact, the next 3 weeks, Rabbi Carney Rose is going to be teaching on Thursday nights, the P's and Q's of Passover, and really looking at ritual and tradition around Passover as it's coming up. And those classes they'll be hybrid, but they will be in person, and encourage anyone who's able to make it out in person to join in person. Otherwise, of course, join on Zoom. Would be great to have you. And I do want to give a quick plug after Pesach. Cantor Shipman will be coming back for the first time since he stepped down from the congregation to teach here at B'nai Yeshurun. 6-week series after Pesach for 6 weeks. Also hybrid. Encourage anyone who can come and be with him in person to join, or you could, of course, join on Zoom for those who are not able to in person. So stay tuned.
What is the
Going to
nature of
teach.
what he's teaching?
He's teaching, there's 3 classes on 2 different topics. So one is the how and why of Jewish ritual, which he'll be looking at. And then the power of nature in our tradition. So 3 classes on the hows and whys of Jewish ritual, and 3 sessions on, you know, how the power of nature in our tradition, looking at, you know, how the sun and the moon are depicted, how the natural world is depicted in Jewish sources and Jewish texts.
Oh, that sounds
That's
interesting.
different.
So
Mhm.
yeah,
When
they should
when
be
will
great
that start?
classes.
When will that start?
Well, so there's 3 classes, April 4th, 11th, and 18th on Passover with Rabbi Carney Rose. And then Cantor Schiffman starts May 2nd, I believe is the Thursday, and it's 6 consecutive weeks. So it's
Bye.
all Thursdays, May 2nd through June 6th.
Mm-hmm. So
Right
basically a
up in-
month.
Yeah,
Oh,
a little over a
Hold
month
on a
leading
minute,
up
I just
until
have to
Shavuot.
get off here.
Mhm.
So good. Take
Thank
care.
you
Have a good
very
evening,
much.
everyone.
Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Thank you.
Is
Thanks for doing this.
Is anybody teaching
you.
between Pesach and Shavuos? Is anybody teaching Pirkei Avot, which is traditional?
So that is traditional. I don't know. We're not having a Thursday night class on it, but I will get back to you. I'm not sure. Possibly our Thursday lunch and learn if that's
Rabbi
something
Hal
that
tended
Rabbi
to take that
Jacobs
up
wants to do.
on his noon class at that time of year. At least he did last year.
Right, maybe the Monday noon. Well, we'll get back to you, either the Monday noon class or the Thursday noon